Hello and welcome back to the Baselight Learning Program. It's good to see you again. This session we're looking at the Baselight Stack, and as always please feel free to type any questions that you may have into the chat and I'll try and answer them at the end. Okay, let's get started. The stack is the name we give to a vertical collection of strips in the Baselight timeline. It represents the various operations which will be applied in the image processing pipeline. The top strip in the stack always represents the source. Normally this would be an image sequence, but it could also be an internally generated source, such as a blank strip or color bars. Source strips have no inputs. However, other strips in the stack typically have at least one input: grading operators, filters, image transforms, and so on. Some strips can have more than one input. For example, the blend and dissolve operators combine two inputs together. And some strips can also take a matte input to use for isolating a grade to a specific area, for example. In this session, we'll take a look at the different types of strip and how they work within the stack. We'll also have a look at some of the tools available to help us manage and edit the stack. In this scene, you can see that each shot has its own stack. Normally, all the strips in a stack will line up with the start and the end of the source strip. However, that doesn't have to be the case. For example, if I add another grading operator to this stack just by pressing P, you can see that by default, the strip has been added so that it matches the length of the existing strips in the stack. However, I can edit the end of this strip up here in the parameters view so that it actually extends all the way to the end of the timeline, which I happen to know is at 3:36 and 24 frames. Now you can see that this grading layer, which is called layer 101 now, extends all along the bottom of the timeline across all the shots. And if I adjust the balance, say, you can see on the thumbnails that it's increased the balance of all the shots, as you would expect it to. And there's nothing wrong with doing this, except if I now wanted to add another grading layer which just affects the first stack. For example, if I were to press P now, which is the shortcut to add another layer, you can see that it thinks, because the last layer spanned the whole timeline, that this stack actually now spans the whole timeline. So this isn't necessarily the best way to work. It's fine if the strip that you're adding is the last thing you're doing, but if you continue to work beyond that, then it would be better to restrict the strips that you're adding to the width of the stack for each shot, which is the way that Baselight would normally work. So I'll just undo that. Now, as I already mentioned, the input is always at the top of the stack and the image processing progresses downwards. Now you'll notice that these stacks here actually have gaps in the middle of them. Now that doesn't matter. Baselight will ignore any gaps and it'll just simply send the output of one strip into the input of the next one. And you could end up with gaps in the stack, for example, if you delete a strip that you don't need anymore. And we'll look at that a little bit later on. So let's have a look at a typical stack. I'm going to take this shot here, for example, and we'll have a look at each of the strips in the stack. Now, if you've watched the session on cursors, you will know that the row cursor can be used to select the point where you actually view the stack, the point within the processing pipeline. And we can move the row cursor up and down in order to select any particular point in the stack to view. So I'll move it all the way up to the top to start with. And of course, this is now looking at the source of the stack, in other words, the input image sequence. As I move down to the next strip, this is applying a base grade operator. The next one down is applying a film grade operator. The next one's boost shadows, and so on. Now we get to a strip which is called reference. Now I'll come back and explain reference strips in a minute. We'll skip over that one, and the next one is D key, and as its name implies, this is a D key keyer operator. And the next one down is the mat tool, which is modifying the key operator. But we'll carry on down the stack. You'll see the next one is applying a hue shift, and then there's another reference, another key, another mat tool. Then we have a shape, then a vignette layer, and finally a few more grading layers, which are applying various different operators. Now you probably noticed that some of these strips are labelled layer. So I should explain what a layer is in Baselight, because it has certain significance. So in the Baselight Stack, we refer to a layer as an actual image processing layer. Now a layer could just be a simple single operator or a combination of operators which are applied to the entire image, and that would be a primary layer. However, a layer could also include a layer mat, which is made up of one or more mat operators. And Baselight provides a layer view, which makes it a bit easier to see what's happening in each layer. So if we go to the Views menu and open the Layers view, and I'll just put it over here. If I scroll up to the top, and in fact I'm going to change it, click this button here that says Large Mat View, and that'll actually show us side by side a thumbnail for the actual image at the layer, and to the right of it is the layer mat, if there is a layer mat within that specific layer. So we can see that layer 0 is the top layer, and that is the input sequence. The top of a stack, which is, as I said, the source of the stack, is always called layer 0. Then the layers increase in numerical order from that point downwards. So then we have layer 1, which is a base grade, layer 2, which is a film grade, layer 3, which is applying boost shadows, and notice that none of these layers have a layer mat. Layer 5 is adjusting the shadows, layer 4, layer 5 is adjusting the highlights, and then we get to layer 7. I'm not sure what happened to layer 6, presumably it was deleted for some reason. Now you can see that layer 7 has a layer mat, and if we look over at the stack we can see that we jumped from layer 5 here down to layer 7 here, and these three strips in the middle are all working together to create the mat for layer 7. So let's have a quick look and see how we can tell that. Well, first of all, if I click on the layer itself, you can see at the top here it says layer 7, and in fact the layer number in the cursor's view also says 7. But if I click on any of the strips above that, you can see that they also say layer 7. And that way we know that those are all part of layer 7. So those strips and layers, the actual grading layer itself, together they make up what we call layer 7. So it's important to understand the distinction between a strip and a layer in the timeline stack. Now, one thing that you can't really see in the layer stack is how this mat was created. So I'm just going to close the layers view, and I've prepared some little diagrams which we call node graphs, which should make it a bit easier to see how these strips are linked together within each layer. And I've actually got a couple of other shots down here at the start of the timeline which will make things a little bit easier to see. As you can see, the top strip in this particular stack is color bars operator. So if we move down to the first layer, we can see that this is applying a base grade, and if we look at the node graph display for this, we can see that it's very simple. The base grade layer is just simply taking the output of the layer above, which is the bars layer. If we now move down to the next layer, which is actually layer 2, we can see that that has obviously a more complicated node graph. Now let's just see how the strips in the stack relate to the parts of the node graph that we have here. Well, first of all, we can see that layer 2 is being fed from the base grade from layer 1. So this is obviously the image path, but then layer 2 is also being affected by a hue angle keyer. The matte is being created by a hue angle key, and that in turn is taking its input from a reference. So you can see the reference strip here, and that reference itself, if we look at the operator up here, we can see that the reference is using layer 1, so layer 1 being the base grade. So we can see that layer 1 is feeding into the reference, which is feeding into the hue angle, which is creating the key, and in this case it's actually pulling a key on the magenta bar. However, there is also a shape being applied too, and what's happening here is the shape, you can see there's a shape strip here, the shape is being used as a garbage mat to the hue angle key. And if I actually disable the shape, if I click on here and then just bypass the shape, you'll notice that if we look at the output of the hue angle key, it's actually, the key itself is selecting magenta, so it's actually selecting both this area and this area of the color bars. And so that shape, if I enable it again now, that shape here is being combined with the key to give us just this part of the color bars. So just from these 3 layers here, we actually have this node graph. So you can see that in the timeline it is a lot simpler to look at, but it's not always easy to see what is actually going on in terms of the signal flow. Now you may be wondering how layer 2 knows that it needs both an image input and also a matte input. Well, that is because when the stack was created and when we added the hue angle key, Baselight automatically enabled this button here, which says foregrade. And you can see here it says use matte foregrade. So this particular layer, this particular operator, is now going to try and find a matte to use for the grade. And the way Baselight works is it looks for the strip above the layer strip in the stack for the matte. So that's why it's using this input here as the matte. Now if I click on the hue angle, you will see that that also has the use matte button enabled. So the hue angle itself is also looking for an input to use for its own matte. And that means that it will be looking for the strip to the strip above to find its own matte, which in this case is the shape. And by that mechanism, the shape is being used to garbage matte the hue angle, which is being used as a matte for the actual grade layer itself. Now, as a keyer itself needs an input image to work off, it takes that from the strip above its own matte input, which in this case, as you can see, is the reference strip. And if I just select that again, you can see that the settings here, as I briefly said earlier, are feeding the output of layer 1 via the reference into the hue angle keyer. Now we'll be looking at reference strips in more detail in another session. Okay, let's just move down to the final layer, layer 3, and this layer, if I click on the layer strip, you can see this also has the use matte for grade button enabled, which means it'll also be looking for a matte from the strip above, and in this case you can see that it is in fact a shape strip. And if we look at the layer graph for layer 3, you can see that layer 3 has its image input coming from layer 2 and its matte input coming from the shape operator, which is this strip here. And layer 3 itself, if we just click on the operator, is applying 2 operators inside and outside the matte. Now we're not going to be looking at inside-outside grading in this session, but that is how Baselight actually uses mattes in layers, in secondary layers. It has 2 sets of operators. The inside operators will be working inside the matte, in other words, processing the white parts of the mat, and in this case that's applying a hue shift, and the outside operators, they're affecting the black parts of the mat. So in this case it's a video grade that's being used to darken the image. Okay, I've got a couple more example stacks here just to show you how stacks can be combined together. So this next one here has a blend operator at the bottom. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, a blend operator takes two inputs and combines them together. And if we look up from the blend operator, you'll see that we actually have two source strips. Now, that means that, technically speaking, each of these is a separate stack, because if you remember, a stack has a source strip at the top. So this is what we call a composite stack. The blend operator is being used to combine these two separate stacks. In this case, neither of these stacks has any grading operators, and the blend operator is just being used to mix or create a dissolve between those two input strips. If I move to the next stack here, now this one is also a composite stack, but in this case the blend operator has its own use matte button enabled. So as with the layers in this first stack, the blend layer itself is looking for a matte to use to do the blend, and the strip directly above it is obviously being used for that matte, and if we click on that we can see that it is a shape, a circle in this case, and so that's what's being used to control the blend between these two input layers. And the final one here is also a more complex stack. Again, the blend operator has use matte enabled. The strip directly above that one is a matte merge. Now, a matte merge, as its name implies, will merge two mattes together. So this is looking for two inputs, and in fact you can see here the number of inputs is set to 2, and it therefore uses the two strips directly above it as its two inputs, and in this case it's combining two shapes. It's combining a circle and a square to give us the composite matte that looks like this. And again, that's then being used with the blend operator, being used by the blend operator, sorry, to blend between these two inputs, between the bars and that image sequence. And I can just show you a quick node diagram of that, just so you can see more clearly how that's all working. So here we have the node diagram version of that blend layer. So you can see here is the blend operator, and it's expecting two inputs, two image inputs to blend between, but it's also expecting a matte input because the use matte button is enabled, and it's taking that from the layer above, which is the matte merge, which itself is expecting two inputs, and it's taking therefore the two strips above that to create the combined matte. So you can see, once you understand how the strips in the stack work, and effectively from the layer strip you go upwards, the image flow is downwards, but each layer itself is looking upwards to find its inputs, then it's much easier to understand how the stack is working. Now, it's also worth pointing out that a knowledge of how the strips in the stack work also helps you to know when you should and shouldn't delete strips in the stack. For example, if I go back to this particular stack here, and I decide that I actually don't want the shape in there, I just want to do a straight blend between these two shots, I might think it would be okay to just click on the shape and press delete. Of course, that doesn't work because we also need to tell the blend strip that we don't want to use a matte anymore. Now, you understand that now because you know how the stack is built up, but it's still a few extra steps to take. You don't want to have to go in and keep unclicking use matte buttons. So a better way of doing that, when you want to remove anything from the stack, if I just undo that, is to use the remove operator or remove strip command, and in most cases that is holding shift and then pressing the letter for the shortcut. So in the case of a shape, for example, we hold shift and then press S, and that's removed the shape, but it's also turned off the use matte button. If you're working on a blackboard control panel, then typically it's the same, holding shift on the panel and then pressing the appropriate button, shape, hue angle and so on will do the same. Okay, I've got one other example of a composite stack. If I go back down, if I zoom out a little bit in the timeline here and move back down to this stack here, you can actually see that we have got two stacks, one on top of each other. And if I move the row cursor all the way up to the very top, you'll see that the first stack is using this image sequence, and it's got various layers doing various things to it, and that's the final output from this first stack. And then if we move down to the next one, we can see that we've actually got a completely different image sequence for this stack, and again we've got various layers processing the image in that one. And then the very bottom one here, the very bottom layer, this is actually, if I just move this back down here, this is a layer strip which has been set into composite mode. In this particular case, it's been set to matte from a foreground shape. So that means that this layer itself, we will be looking for a shape in order to do the composite. And again, it'll be looking directly to the layer, to the strip, sorry, directly above the layer. And in this case, it is a shape. And in fact, you can see the shape here. So the shape is being used to define the foreground and the background for the composite, and those in turn are being taken from the two stacks, so this stack and the stack above it. Anyway, we'll be covering composite layers and more compositing operations in Baselight in another session. So the last thing I'm going to show you is how we can actually manage the stack a little bit. You can see that the timeline itself is made up of different height stacks. Each of the shots has a different number of strips, and therefore the stacks are different heights. And this is inevitable as you're working, because obviously some shots need more grading than others, so you end up with more strips on certain stacks. Now, as I said, it doesn't really matter as far as Baselight is concerned. It will just process the stack and it'll skip over any gaps there may be. But let's just say you want to neaten it up a little bit. You want to try and sort of close up some of these gaps. Well, it's possible to move strips manually just simply by selecting them. You can drag across them in the timeline, and then holding down the Alt key and using the up and down arrows allows you to move strips up and down. But you have to be a little bit careful when you're doing this, because if you move it a bit too far, what will happen is it'll now bounce that strip below up above. So you can see that the layer that was below boost is now bounced up to the top of the timeline, to the top of the stack. So you need to be a bit careful if you're doing that. But there is also a way of automatically lining up the timeline. Now, as it stands at the moment, the timeline is arranged so that the bottom of the stacks are all sitting at the bottom. So in other words, they're all lined up at the bottom. But sometimes it's nicer to see things so that all of the source strips are lined up together, so you can clearly see how each stack is processing the image. So we've got an option on the Views menu called Timeline Alignment. And we've got two basic options in this to align the stack either to the tops or the bottoms. So if I want to align it to stack tops, if I now click the Align button, you'll see that the timeline now has all the stacks so that the top of the stack lines up. And obviously not all the bottoms are now going to be the same. Another option, as we had before, is to align the stack bottoms. You can also line up a specific set of layers within the stack. For example, if we want to line up all of the boost shadows layers, we could select them, and I'm not going to select this on every shot, but let's say we wanted to align those ones. We can say align selected strips within each stack, and if I click on the Align button now, for those first, zoom in a bit here, you can see for those first shots where I selected those strips, it's aligned all of those together. So at various points while you're working in the timeline, you might decide that you want to align things up so you can see more clearly what's going on. So the timeline alignment view is the best way to do that. Okay, so there was one question in the chat, and that was specifically asking about parallel layers. Now, by parallel layers, most people mean the ability to send either combine two signals together or to send a signal down two separate paths and then combine them together again. In other words, two things happening in parallel and then being combined. Now, one of the ways I've already shown you, which is where you actually combine two separate stacks together using a blend operator. But Baselight also has a blending operator built into each layer. And if I go back to the first shot here, just as an example, so if we take layer 3, for example, if I click on layer 3, now at the moment you can see that layer 3 is performing an inside-outside grade, but we also have a result blending slider. Now at the moment, result blending is set to 0. In other words, what we're actually seeing is the output of this particular layer. But if I wanted to blend back to a previous layer, I can just simply move the slider over and you'll see we're now blending all the way back to the previous one. So we're basically combining two separate grades there, the before and after grade. Now, if we want to go further back or to a different point in the stack, I can click on this button here and you can now see we've actually got two parallel paths. One is the inside-outside grade and the other one is a path which by default is going back to the input of this particular layer, and our blending control will vary the amount as you've seen between those two. However, we can choose to blend back to a different point, so we can go back to an earlier point in the stack, or even we can blend to a separate input layer, which would be the same as doing a blend operator between two stacks. So if I want to go back to a numbered layer, for example, I can click on here and now I can choose the layer that I want to blend back to. For example, if I wanted to blend back to the output of the base grade layer. So now we're taking the signal at the base grade point in the stack, and we are taking that down two separate paths, effectively two parallel paths, and then combining them with a blend at the end here. And you'll notice that the blend itself also has the option to just do a straight mix, or we can click on this button here and we have any of the standard Photoshop blending modes available to blend between these two parallel paths. So, and we will be covering blending modes and much more complex stack operations in one of our advanced sessions later on. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.